Hello. Last week you did an assignment called the model so far, and you wrote down a lot of information that you know about the atom so far. And what you were really writing about was Dalton's model of the atom. And Dalton described the atom as essentially hard objects that when they're in gases, they bounce off each other. And when they're in liquids, they're touching, but they're still bouncing around. When they're solids, they're still moving, but they're lined up in rows. And these hard objects can attach to other atoms and make molecules and make all sorts of things. So we've been studying that the first half of the year, but yesterday or last week, we did an experiment where we used sticky tape and we found that it attracts and repels to different things. And we are having some difficulty perhaps coming up with a reason why it should be attracting or repelling. Yes, we say there's plus and minus charge, but where does that come from and what does that look like? So that is what we are studying now, is we're trying to get a better idea of what must be happening. And it must be happening in the atoms because atoms make up everything. So this charge that we're talking about must be from atoms. And so we're going to look at today, or you're going to look at some videos about an experiment that was done, experiments that were done in 1897 and a little bit earlier than that. And they were done in something called a Crookes tube. And you're going to need to listen very carefully here because I'm giving you definitions, terms that you're going to need to know. All right, this is a horrible drawing. It's supposed to be a glass tube. And so that glass tube is called a Crookes tube. And the thing about that glass tube is it is evacuated. Evacuated just means all the air is taken out. It's made into a vacuum inside. All right. And in that glass tube, there is something called an electrode. There's an electrode. And I'm going to put this little thing here. This is a negative electrode. All right. Now, what's an electrode? An electrode is just a wire, like a pole, like a part of a battery. Okay, so that thing right there, that little negative there, is part of a battery. All right, and I shouldn't say it's a battery. It is actually a part of a high voltage source. So if you were to touch that, you'd get a shock. All right, now if you have a negative end to a battery, you also need a positive end. And so a cathode ray tube also had a positive electrode. Every cathode ray tube would. And so I'm going to write that positive electrode right here. I'm actually going to erase the middle part of that. It's actually in a kind of a donut shape in the cathode ray tube. And so I'm erasing that portion of it. And I'm going to call that positive. All right. And it also must be connected to a wire. So right down here, here's a wire. And it's a little hard to draw these, but there's my wire going around, and you guys know that it has to be connected in a circuit. All right. So I have negative and positive, and these are high voltage inside a cathode ray tube. All right. Again, these two things that I've drawn, this negative is called an electrode, and this positive one is also called an electrode, but they have separate names also. The negative one is called a cathode. Okay, that's why this is called a cathode ray tube, because something's going to happen with the cathode in this tube when we turn it on. All right, so there is our cathode in the cathode ray tube. And this part right here is an anode. Okay, so the positive electrode is an anode. All right, and so you're going to need to remember those and write those down in your terms on your worksheet for today. Okay. What else? What other terms might be in there? The man in the first video is going to talk about a Tesla coil. A Tesla coil is just a way to make a high voltage. And so he's going to connect his Tesla coil right up to here. So it's going to be connected to this electrode. All right. And that's going to make something happen. Okay. So your job today is to look at the cathode ray tube and look at the experiments that were done with the cathode ray tube, and then understand what conclusions were made by a man named J.J. Thomson when he looked at the cathode ray tube and did experiments with it. Okay, so do your best to understand everything you can about this cathode ray tube today.